Many years ago, I wrote Wild Swans, Three Daughters of China. The book begins with my grandmother's birth in 1909, when China was under the last emperor, moves through Mao Zedong's rule, 1949 to 76, especially its last decade, the horrendous Cultural Revolution, during which my parents were subjected to painful ordeals, and finishes in 1978, when Dang Xiaoping officially ended the Mao era and started the reforms. At that propitious juncture, I became one of the first Chinese to leave communist China for the West. Since then, nearly half a century has gone by, and China has risen from a decrepit and isolated state to a global power. In those decades, although I have been living in London as a British citizen, my life has been entwined with my native land. My mother lives there, so I visited her almost every year until recently, when the political climate made this impossible. I've called this book Fly, Wild Swans, as a tribute to my mother, whose deathbed I'm unable to visit. She has given me wings so I can take to the sky and be free. I landed in London on the 13th of September 1978 with 13 other Chinese students, one doubling as the political supervisor. I was 26 years old. Setting foot in London was like landing on Mars. I had no idea what the West was really like. In my childhood, the images of a little girl dying of hunger and cold on Christmas Eve in The Little Match Girl by Hans Christian Andersen, and a famished boy holding out an empty bowl in Oliver Twist, translated into Chinese as Orphan in the Capital of Fog, had left indelible impressions. Although I had grown sceptical about the stories the regime had fed me, I had no mental picture of the West. I was bursting with curiosity. My excitement was dealt a heavy blow when, the day after our arrival, an embassy official came to our hostel and in an all-day talk stressed the rules regarding contact with foreigners. We were told never to step out of the hostel without permission, and even with permission, at least 2 people must go together. And if those 2 people were related, a 3rd person was required. Inside the building, the curtains on the windows facing the street had to be closed even in daytime. My bedroom, which I shared with one other, was unfortunately in that position. Feeling suffocated and yearning for a bit of real London, even the famed English rain, I lifted a corner of the curtain to peep out whenever I was on my own. 2 days later, an announcement came allowing us to go out, so off we went as a group to Hyde Park. When the magnificent oaks and chestnuts over the lush lawns came into view, I was ecstatic and longed to throw myself on the ground to embrace the grass. In my early teens, Mao had denounced cultivating flowers and grass as feudal and bourgeois. Although by the time I left China, horticulture was no longer treated as an enemy of the state, there was still virtually no houseplants and gardens. Hyde Park became my favourite place in London. Moving as a group, we were quite a sight in the London streets. We all wore the same uniform-like blue jackets and baggy trousers, the so-called Mao suits, made for us in Beijing shortly before we left China in a store which specialised in kitting out people going abroad. The shop tailor was elderly with an efficient professional demeanour. When my turn came to be measured, I asked somewhat timidly, "Are we all going to have the same clothes?" The tailor gave me a quizzical look, but said nothing. When we returned to the counter, where he wrote down my measurements, he took out from underneath a colour supplement from the New York Times. It seemed to be about fashion. The tailor flipped through the supplement under the counter, stopping at a page of models in coats. Without a word, he pointed at one, and I nodded. This happened in a split second. When the new clothes came, I flung open the wrappings and saw in one glance that my coat was different from the others. The standard coats were all cut in the same style and all in charcoal black, but mine had a slightly different cut, and its colour had a shade of grey in the black, a colour I had never seen. When I put it on, I felt instantly stylish. And I did not have to fear criticism, as the differences were so subtle that they would be hard to pinpoint. My group moved into a boarding house near Ealing College of Higher Education, where a course had been designed for us. We studied Western politics, society and customs, and read Shakespeare, Henry James, and D.H. Lawrence. We were taken to the National Theatre to see Look Back in Anger by John Osborne, and to a cricket match and the Leyland Lorry Factory. My fellow Chinese, with whom I was on friendly terms, focused diligently on their studies. I, too, worked hard and often went to bed after midnight. But I was restless. Have a good time. That's what I must do, I had written in my diary on my first day in London, but I did not even know what a good time meant. Luckily, there was no restriction on talking to others in the college. One evening, the French and German students threw a fancy dress party. When the thrilling music spurred more and more people onto the floor, I danced disco for the first time and was having wild fun. More so as I noticed that my fellow male suitors were dancing as well, with wide grins on their faces. The British general election, which Margaret Thatcher would win, was coming, and as British politics was very much a subject for our studies, we went along to a town hall debate and listened earnestly. But my memory of the event was overshadowed by a subsequent discovery. A jumble sale in a church that we passed on our way home. We had no idea what it was, and just went in to have a look as the church hall seemed buzzing with activity. We were astonished to find that the clothes there cost only 5 to 20 pence apiece, and so we loaded up. In the next year or so, my wardrobe consisted largely of dresses from that jumble sale, and a student complimented me for always wearing beautiful vintage. I could not wait to lose myself in London's crowds. This involved breaking many rules. We had been specifically warned not to go into a pub, whose Chinese translation, 酒吧, in those days suggested somewhere indecent, with naked women gyrating. The ban roused my curiosity, so one day I sneaked out of the college and dashed across the street into a pub. At first everything was a blur, as I was too nervous. Then I calmed down and saw there was nothing sensational. No drunkards throwing bottles, no dark corners where couples were fondling each other, and certainly no naked women. Only some elderly men sitting quietly with pints of beer in front of them. I was rather disappointed. Still, for some time after it stopped being taboo, going to a pub remained the most glamorous thing for me to do. The biggest rule to break was the ban on going out without a fellow Chinese chaperone. One day, a member of staff at the college, with whom I chatted often, invited me to go to Greenwich in south-east London, where the meridian line divided the hemispheres of west and east. When I mentioned bringing a friend, he misunderstood and said in a wounded tone, "You are safe with me." I was embarrassed, but was bound by our rules not to tell the real reason. I hated the compulsory lying and was very keen to go, and so when my group was next in the embassy, where we checked in regularly, I pleaded with the education counsellor to give me permission. Otherwise, I implored, this Englishman would think we suspected his motives, which would be damaging to Anglo-Chinese friendship and the reputation of our motherland. At the end of this, the counsellor nodded, not without hesitation. That outing, I believe, was the first time that a Chinese under the supervision of the embassy went out alone, not on an official mission, but for pleasure. The counsellor dared to give me this groundbreaking permission because China was dramatically changing. In December 1978, a milestone party congress took place in Beijing. Dang Xiaoping was now unquestionably the paramount leader, and the Chinese Communist Party formally dumped the core of Maoism, committing itself to a degree of liberalization. The post-Mao reforms officially began. Deng decreed that China must make friends with the West, which he saw as the only way to pull the country out of abject poverty. I was elated by the news from China, although I was also aware that a 28-year-old man, Wei Jingsheng, had put up a poster on a wall in Beijing calling for democracy and was consequently imprisoned. Wei had pointed out that without democracy our springtime would not last. He had far sight, but at the time I was too preoccupied with devising schemes to go out on my own. When the course required us to research an essay about the history of an object, I decided to write about gas cookers, although I had little interest in cooking or anything to do with machines. But I had seen cookers during a group visit to the Science Museum and had registered that the museum was a stone's throw from Hyde Park and central London. Writing the paper involved research in the museum, which provided me with a legitimate excuse to travel to the places I longed to see, alone, as no one else in my group wanted to accompany me. So, for days, I had the perfect reason to be wandering about London freely, indulging my craving to lie on the, by now very cold, ground of Hyde Park, and staring at the sky through the crowns of the trees. While I was in raptures exploring the city, my nerves were on high alert, watching out for possible informers. Many a Chinese-looking person who wore clothes remotely resembling a Mao suit scared me into hiding my face. Of course, I took copious notes in the Science Museum, but I was also taken to tea at Fortnum and Mason, and I was introduced to McDonald's hamburgers, which did not live up to my expectation of American cuisine. In 1979, after her year of studying with other Chinese students in London, the author was awarded a scholarship to study for a master's degree in linguistics at the University of York. She threw herself into independent life in England. Then, in 1980, she met Yu Chunyi, a Singaporean pianist and professor of the piano at the Royal College of Music in London, who began to woo her. He taught her to drive, and together they travelled to the continent on holiday. In the south of France, I waded into the sea and with Yi's help suddenly started swimming. I had never been able to swim when I was in China, despite the school swimming lessons in a small river. Over there, We had been told to imagine that if we did not swim across the river, we would be captured by pursuing American soldiers and tortured. Fear had given me cramps, and swimming had been a nightmare, until now, in the Mediterranean. Throughout those years in York, the Chinese embassy made hardly any contact. Each time my scholarship was extended, which meant I would stay on another year, I dutifully wrote, and the embassy acknowledged my letter. Otherwise, I was left alone and barely thought of China. In April 1982, Yi and I decided to get married, and I was confronted with the prospect of breaking another rule, this time a big one. The Chinese were not allowed to marry foreigners. Yi was in fact ethnically Chinese, but he was Singaporean, and so a foreigner. The danger of being branded a defector if I did not return to live in the motherland after marriage was very real. Even if the regime could do nothing about me as I was outside China, it might well harm my family. I thought of my youngest brother, Xiaofan, who was a student of French at the Sichuan Foreign Languages Institute. With a sister as a defector, he would never be allowed to go near a foreigner, let alone go abroad. I could not bear bringing disaster to my family. The practice in China at the time for people who wanted to get married was that they must first apply to their work unit for permission. Mine was the Foreign Language Department of Sichuan University. Although I had stopped working there years before, its party committee was still my boss. Now it said no to my request to marry and ordered me to return to the department immediately. I tore up the letter, but thinking of my family in China, I put the torn parts back together and forced myself to reply and argue my case. From Sichuan came demands. Please come back and discuss with your elderly mother, she was only 50, before making such an important decision like marriage. The embassy offered me plane tickets, return, presumably to make me think I could get out again. I thanked them and said I could not leave Britain as I was at the last stage of my doctoral thesis, which was true. I wrote to my mother in Chengdu at the same time I informed the embassy. I kept my letter brief to disassociate her from any consequences of my action. By the time my letter arrived, my mother had already learned about my plan to marry. She had come home one day to find her flat crowded with waiting officials. They were the party bosses from my work unit, the bosses' bosses from the Higher Education Bureau of Sichuan, as well as all the other work units to do with foreign affairs in the province. From that moment on, daily visitors bombarded her with persuasion, centering on one thing. Tell your daughter to return to China at once, or else. But my mother, who had withstood superhuman pressure under far worse circumstances, was unfazed. She did not refuse the authorities' demands outright, but circumvented the marriage issue, only arguing that I must get my doctoral degree first before returning to China, an argument no one could dispute. She wrote to tell me emphatically that she would not see me until I had my PhD in my hands. My siblings wrote to tell me that I must under no circumstances think of them when making decisions, assuring me that they were quite capable of dealing with their own situations. With my family so strongly behind me, I decided to marry as soon as my doctoral thesis was finished, in this order, because I wanted to show my mother that I was putting my independence first. I was able to finish the thesis in June and delivered it to my professor, who accepted it. Yi and I were married at a registry office in London on the 28th of June, 1982. The next day, I wrote to inform the party bosses at Sichuan University, offering to keep contact and help with its language teaching. Then I went with Yi to the Chinese embassy to give them the news and show our goodwill. This was the first time I stepped on Chinese soil since I had gone to York and begun a free life nearly 3 years before. As we crossed the threshold of the 18th century house in central London, where, according to all the cautionary tales, I could be detained, my legs suddenly went weak. Yi, who was holding my hand, later told me he had never seen me so frightened. The official at the embassy received my news of marriage in a non-committal manner, but he did not condemn me and was polite. It was after I came out of the building with this encouraging sign that I telephoned my mother and told her about my marriage and the embassy's reaction. Soon afterwards, my mother was again overjoyed when I became the first person from communist China to obtain a doctorate from a British university. In August 1983, Beijing lifted the ban on Chinese marrying foreigners. Yi and I headed for Chengdu in September. Before we left London, my mother asked me to let as many people as possible know that I was only paying her a short visit and would be back in London soon. I was puzzled by the strange fuss. Only later did I realize that this was to preempt the scenario of the authorities refusing to let me leave. Having been in the party for decades, my mother was always prepared for the worst. The party was not the only force that made her anxious. One piece of malicious gossip deeply unsettled her. When Yi and I were about to leave London, she wrote and told me to ask Yi to dye his hair, which was greying as he was 45 years old. There was a rumour circulating in Chengdu that I had married an old man, with the innuendo that I might be his concubine. The rumour did not bother me, and I was surprised that my mother should care so much. Yi did not want to dye his hair, nor did I want him to. So we did nothing. But I was distressed by the disagreement with my mother. Just before we left our hotel for the airport in Guangzhou, where we had stayed for a couple of days to change planes, my distress became acute, and I looked at Yi inquiringly. He nodded, and I hastily brushed some black ink on his hair to cover the grey. On the flight, when he leaned back, the ink stained the white cover on the headrest, and he sat up straight to avoid touching it. Seeing him be so uncomfortable, I felt very upset. My mother was at the foot of the plane to meet us. Before she hugged me, my mother went straight to Yi and apologized for making him dye his hair. She said she had acted on impulse and had made a mistake. When we got home, Yi rinsed off the ink. Years later, when my mother was telling me about my grandma's life, I suddenly understood why she had acted in that uncharacteristically panicky way. The innuendo had touched a raw nerve. My grandmother suffered most of her life for having been a concubine. Even though she had no choice when her father married her off, then 15 years old, to General Xu. When the general, my grandfather, died in 1933, she fell in love with a Manchu doctor, Dr. Xia, and they wanted to get married with her as his proper wife, not a concubine. The doctor was a widower, and the children in his extended family were against the marriage, telling him that marrying a former concubine would bring shame to their family. After they went ahead and married, my mother, aged 4, was relentlessly bullied and nearly died when she was pushed down a dry well in the garden. All that humiliation and anger rushed back when my mother heard the innuendo against me, and all she could think about was how to protect me from being hurt when I was in Chengdu. One day, Mother and I found ourselves near the front gate of the People's Park. We strolled along flower beds to an open space, which had been a dance floor in the 1950s, then a venue for mass denunciation meetings in the Cultural Revolution. The stage that had been built for the orchestra became the platform on which the denounced were forced to stand. Now, there were some pots of chrysanthemums waiting to be exhibited in a flower show. My mother and I found a bench and sat down. She asked me whether I remembered having come here with her for a denunciation rally at which she had been one of the victims. I remembered it well. It was in 1967, and perhaps the biggest denunciation meeting against her, with thousands of participants. Then, 15 years old, I insisted on going with her to wait for the rally to finish and bring her home. I saw my mother being forced to bend double, a large plaque hung over her neck by a thin wire. On it was written in giant characters, "Down with the stinking wife of Dang Xiaoping," my father's name. She was put through the ordeal for refusing to disown my father. Next to me, the hysterical crowd thrust their fists up. My heart was pounding. I buried my head in my knees to shut out the sight and sound. By the end of the rally, my mother collapsed on the stage. Eventually, with my support, she managed to get home. With our eyes now on the chrysanthemums, neither of us said anything about that event. The author's first marriage ended in amicable divorce, and soon after she began a relationship with the Irish historian John Halliday, who also had an interest in researching modern Asia. In the meantime, a gradual liberalization of the regime in China meant that her mother was finally able to get permission to visit Britain. In February 1988, my mother arrived at Gatwick Airport. As she wheeled her luggage cart out in a black silk jacket with mandarin collars, I rushed over to hug her. John took her luggage cart and offered his newly acquired Chinese greetings. I longed for my mother to have the best time and took her to all the tourist sites. A decade of open-door policy had given the Chinese a taste of Western consumer goods, and I assumed that, like most other women, my mother would be thrilled to go shopping. But she followed me past rows of clothes, hardly giving them a second glance. One day, I took her to Oxford Street, and when we got to its western edge, her body language suggested a strong reluctance to go further. I said, "Mama, are you really not interested in shopping? You're not just trying to save money for me, are you?" She said, "No, I am really not interested. You have already shown me the shops. I know what they look like, and that's enough." She asked me whether I remembered ever going shopping with her in my 26 years in China. Indeed, I had never done that. It was true that there had not been much to shop for, but there had always been something. I would learn that my mother had shunned shopping for pleasure, initially because it was associated with the limited life of women such as her mother, who were supposed to be contented with just wandering in shops. Then, After she joined the communists, she had to adapt to their puritanical lifestyle. She was criticized by her comrades for using face creams and positively steered herself away from shops. As we turned away from Oxford Street and walked into Hyde Park, I remarked that it would have been wonderful if Grandma were here. She would have loved the shops. As I mentioned Grandma, sadness spread over my mother's face. She had been in detention when her mother was dying and had only been allowed home for 2 days before Grandma died. I kicked myself for bringing up the subject and started talking about the park. When we got to the Italian gardens, Mother paused and, pointing at a big flat round stone on the ground, exclaimed, "Look, this looks just like a millstone. This was the kind of stone they used to put on a baby girl's feet to create the 3-inch golden lilies." My mother's mind was clearly still on Grandma, whose feet had been cruelly bound into the so-called 3-inch golden lilies. Staring at the stone, I was shocked, as I had no idea how exactly foot-binding was carried out. My mother began to explain. When my grandma was 2 years old, her mother, my great-grandmother, had put a millstone on top of her feet to break the bones of 4 toes, leaving only the big toe intact. And then, bending the 4 toes under the arch, she bound the feet tight with a long piece of cloth to stop the broken bones from recovering. The process lasted many years. My grandma begged her mother to stop, but my great-grandmother only wept and told her that unbound feet would ruin her life, as she would not be able to find a husband when she grew up. I had seen my grandma's feet naked when I was a child, after we had gone out shopping. The first thing she always did when we came home was to soak her feet in a bowl of hot water. Only the big toes were normal. The other toes under the arch were limp, as if there were no bones in them. Listening to my mother in Hyde Park, recalling how my grandma had died in unbearable pain, I felt a surge of overwhelming emotions. I was ashamed that I knew so little about her life and pressed my mother to tell me more. My mother had in fact been hoping I would be interested in writing the story of my family. But when she tentatively suggested the idea, I grumbled that I already had so many things to do and that I had no free time. Deep down, I think I did not want to revisit painful memories. My mother said no more, but I noticed that she was not having the time of her life in London as I had hoped. I'd put it down to her not speaking the language and not having friends. But now I understood that she'd been hurt by my apparent indifference. The moment I showed interest, my mother sprang to life. She started talking and could not stop. I told John some of her stories. He asked many questions, which sparked more curiosity in me and brought out more details and stories from my mother. One day, John came to my flat with a photocopy of a page from a who's who in Republican China from the library of the School of Oriental and African Studies. It was a photo of my grandfather, General Xie Zhuheng, police chief of Beijing, 1922 to 24, in full regalia. My mother was overcome by excitement. She had never seen a picture of her father and did not know what he looked like. He had died when she was 2 years old. I felt more intrigued about the past and bought a tape recorder. My mother sat at the dining table all day long, speaking into the tape recorder when I was out working. By the time she returned to China in August 1988, she had left me 60 hours of recordings. Immediately after my mother's departure, I settled at my desk and wrote a long synopsis with John's help for my book, eventually named Wild Swans. Publishers in Britain and America bought the rights. When my mother received my jubilant postcard, she was as elated as I was. In January 1989, I was granted British citizenship. I had lived in Britain for 10 years, which had qualified me to apply. To this generous and kind country, I owe my happy life, and my first and foremost feeling towards it was, and will always be, gratitude. In April, John and I went to China to research wild swans. At the time, we were not yet married. My mother was worried that marriage to a foreigner might be an obstacle to getting interviews from some people. A former boss had turned her down when she mentioned John. Still, she agreed to John staying with me in her flat, even though, as a foreigner, he was supposed to stay in a hotel. John and I had come to China on the eve of a historic moment. Student demonstrations were about to break out at the announcement of the death of Hu Yaobong, the former general secretary of the party, who had been forced to resign 2 years earlier for being too tolerant of young people demanding greater freedom. Crowds of protesters gathered to mourn Hu, venting their anger at his sacking and expressing their aspiration for more liberty. On 26th April, John saw large numbers of agitated youngsters in the square. As he watched, a middle-aged local man among the onlookers turned and spat forcibly at him. Probably the man was not a supporter of the students and hated what he regarded as dirty linen being paraded in front of a foreigner. Or he might even regard John as a Westerner who had stirred up the students, which was the party's standard assertion. The next day, my mother and I were outside her block of flats when a woman approached me with a piece of paper, apparently asking the way. I was about to take the piece of paper when my mother snatched it from her hand, saying, "She," meaning me, "doesn't live here. Give it to me." There were some incomprehensible squiggles on the piece of paper, and the woman grabbed it back and walked away. Afterwards, my mother warned me that I must not take any paper from a stranger, especially now that I had become a British citizen. There was the danger of being accused of receiving state secrets. She never relaxed her alertness about my safety in China. The first stop of our research trip was Yibin, 200 kilometers to the south of Chengdu, the birthplace of my father and me. The region was beautifully green with tea groves and terraced rice paddies which enthralled John. In that area, few people had ever set eyes on a foreigner, and John was a colossal object of curiosity. One day, we were at a bustling country market. John exchanged a few words with a much wrinkled elderly man wearing a turban. They were both laughing, but the staring of some other people was less friendly. My mother kept explaining to the crowds, raising her voice, "A foreign friend! This is a foreign friend!" while conducting us as swiftly as possible towards the office of the local government, which stood on raised ground up a flight of stairs. We sat outside the main gate, and the peasants down below came close to watch John. A few bold children climbed up the stairs and touched John's nose. He good-humouredly played with them, and the crowd seemed to find it highly amusing. Out of the blue, I heard loud speakers on moving trucks. This was a familiar sound in the Cultural Revolution, announcing that some criminals were being paraded. I had seen my father on such a truck one day, his hands tied behind his back, and a plaque hanging from his neck announcing that he was a counter-revolutionary. 2 men behind him were trying to push his head down, and my father was struggling to lift his head, a scene that had given me such a piercing pain in my heart. I stood up to see what was happening. A line of the same kind of open trucks was again parading criminals, each with 2 men behind holding their guns at the ready. This time, judging from the plaques hanging from their necks, they were smugglers of opium, women or children, and were en route to be executed. China used the death penalty actively, but I was somewhat surprised to see that it still paraded people before their execution, given that many other barbaric customs had been abolished in the reforms. I picked up John's video camera. My mother slapped my wrist hard and hissed, "What are you doing?" Indeed, the crowds could easily turn nasty against us. As it happened, they took one look at the trucks and turned back to John, who was obviously more of a novelty. In 1989, back in London, after her visit to see her mother, Jung Chang watched the demonstrations in favour of political reform from afar. After the Chinese government sent tanks into Tiananmen Square, killing hundreds of students and protesters, she strongly condemned the action in a television interview, an intervention which terminated her hitherto amicable relationship with the Chinese embassy. Wild Swans was published in the UK in 1992, just a few months after she and John had got married. Publication in countries around the world followed, and so did book tours. It was also during this time that she was successfully treated for breast cancer. In spring 1993, I returned to Chengdu for the first time since 1989. The aftermath of the Tiananmen suppression, my work and illness had combined to prevent me from making the journey. My mother had been worried sick about my health. At the time, tens of millions of Chinese were mad about a type of breathing exercise called Qigong, whose masters had huge followings. Even the official papers carried news about the alleged supernatural powers of some of them. My mother suggested I see one renowned master in Chengdu who had the reputation of curing cancer patients. The Qigong master who came to my mother's flat looked more like a clerk in a government office with a Mao-era blue jacket, a battered briefcase, and an excessive, attentive manner. He asked us not to tell him about my health problems, declaring that he would tell us after the session. On his instruction, I lay face down, and he took a long breath and started to move his hands, palms down, over my body without touching it. He told me I should be able to feel the flow of qi, air, from his palms to my body, and now that he mentioned it, something did seem to be going on there. Soon I dozed off and woke up feeling better. My mother was ecstatic. The Qigong master then told her his diagnosis, that I had had breast cancer and 2 operations. As she had not told this man about my cancer before, my mother was awestruck, and I was also impressed. He came for several days, and each time I fell into a light snooze and felt brighter afterwards. After one session, he told us that he could feel from the flow of the qi that I still had cancer cells inside me, perhaps in the liver. At this my mind went blank, and my mother's face took on a frightened look I had never seen. The Qigong master said that he felt the positive qi from him could drive out the cancerous qi from my body, but it would take time, and it was a pity that I was leaving Chengdu in a few days. Anxiously, my mother asked him whether he would consider going to London to stay with me and clear me of all the cancer cells. He bent his head as if in deliberation, and finally, with an air of resolve, said that although this would involve abandoning his clients in Chengdu and staying away from his family, he felt he must go, as he had so much respect and gratitude for my mother, who had supported the osteopathic hospital when the authorities had wanted to close it down. The Qigong master picked up his briefcase and pulled out a file of documents, on which I only needed to sign as his financial guarantor before he started making the arrangements. There was no doubt that the man was a crook, that he preyed on people made vulnerable by sickness and love. It also occurred to me that it was actually quite easy to find out about my health problems in Chengdu. I politely threw him out, and then turning to my mother with exasperation cried, "Mother, how could you possibly believe this obvious rubbish?" Of course I knew that her desperate fear about my life had made her lose her normal, shrewd judgment. It was also true that my mother, while always on her guard vis-à-vis the regime, was almost naive dealing with conmen, which was a new experience for her. Ever since she was an adult, she had lived in a totalitarian environment in which petty conmen had not had the liberty to thrive. There had also been little to con for, while now there was a lot. In the coming years, my mother would be taken in by other crooks. By the time of my visit, copies of the Chinese edition of Wild Swans, which had just been published in Taiwan, had come into China through travellers and were doing the rounds. The Sichuan television station recorded an interview with me, talking confidently about airing it on Sunday. In Beijing, several publishers got in touch, most very keen, and we settled on the Friendship Publishing House. It asked for permission to omit certain comments in the book to do with Mao, but promised to print on the pages. The following passage has been cut. I agreed. A renowned Chinese writer reviewed the book in the leading literature magazine in China, and a major reformist carried the first chapter in a periodical he had just produced, with plans to serialize other chapters in the following issues. And yet, that spring was brief. After the first issue, the periodical was ordered to fold. My interview with the Sichuan television station was never aired. Wild Swans' Beijing edition was cancelled, having gone to its second proofreading. In the 1990s, as Beijing blocked people's political talents and encouraged the whole population to make money, millions of unfulfilled, clever officials and intellectuals abandoned their careers and went into commercial ventures. This phenomenon had a name, Xiaohai, getting into the sea. My mother did not get into the sea herself, but she had friends who leapt in at the deep end, and they needed money. I'd been sending her some of the royalties from Wild Swans so she could live well, and because they were also her rewards. Many people knew this, and some coveted her cash. There was a visceral disregard for money in my mother. She had grown up knowing that her mother had had a luxurious but sad life as the concubine of General Xie, but was later poor and happy when she married Dr. Xia. With those memories, my mother in her adolescence rejected rich suitors and chose to train to be an ill-paid schoolteacher. Under the communists, the lifestyle of my family was largely unrelated to the salaries of her and my father, but was dependent on the privileges doled out by the party. I was brought up to regard money, qian, as a dirty word. As a child, reading a spy story in comic strip form, I could not comprehend why the spy was motivated by money. How bizarre, I thought. After I came to Britain, unlike most Chinese mothers who would wish their daughters to marry wealthy men in the West, my mother cautioned me against becoming a Nora, who, in Ibsen's A Doll's House, had a rich husband but an unfulfilled life. With this dismissive attitude towards money, my mother was ill-suited to the new money-worshipping society China was becoming. Among those who visited her with an eye for her cash were two men who'd been kind to my father and her in the Cultural Revolution and had suffered as a result. She was deeply grateful and mentioned them, although not by name, in Wild Swans. They saw from the book the depth of her gratitude and came to beg her to invest in their promising business ventures. Their ventures cleaned her out of all the money I had sent her over the previous years. One venture turned out to be a scam that targeted retired officials who had relatively high pensions, and some of whom also had money from their successful children. The main offender was later sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. The victims lost every cent they put in, most of them their homes as well, which the fraudsters had mortgaged. 3 elderly people killed themselves by leaping from the roofs of their apartment buildings. Those casualties of China's introduction to capitalism highlighted the plight of the numerous people who were ill-adapted to a money-oriented society and who were vulnerable to the sharks that thronged the country's money-making sea. My mother reproached herself harshly and felt she had let me down. She did not talk to me about it and just tried to save money in all sorts of ways. I heard about it and sent her more money. I never brought up the subject, but inwardly told her that I loved her more for her all too decent weakness in trusting the wrong people. Eventually, she proposed a solution: that I transfer the money to my sister, who lived in Chengdu and could pay bills for her. So, to friends who came to solicit investment, she could honestly say that she had no money to spare. The ban on Wild Swans was stringent, especially when it came to making a film or television series out of it. Ever since its publication, numerous people have tried hard to dramatize Wild Swans, and quite a few have explored the possibility of shooting it outside China, hoping that this would bypass the Chinese government. But Beijing has a stranglehold. The indispensable distributors and streaming platforms face the threat of their other films being boycotted in China. The regime was less draconian regarding travellers bringing the book into China, and, for a while, pirated editions were being sold on the pavements of streets. The book was known to a lot of people, and fans were not afraid to come forward. One day, after John and I had eaten in a restaurant, when he was about to pay the bill, the restaurant told him that it had already been settled by a young local man who said he had learned about his country's past from your wife's book. On another occasion, when John and I were walking in the streets of Beijing, a car sped around the corner and braked next to us. The window wound down, and the driver poked her head out. "I love your book," she shouted, and then drove off. In 2005, Jung Chang and her husband John Halliday published their book on Chairman Mao. It showed his era as a period of enormous cruelty and tyranny. Inevitably, it was banned in China, but there were more serious repercussions. When the author applied for a visa in 2007 to visit her mother, it was refused. British politicians lobbied on her behalf, but Beijing demanded that she apologize for that book on Mao. At the last minute, the Chinese government relented, and a visa was issued. When I arrived in Chengdu, my mother greeted me with a joyous, "We won," and we embraced each other. I had not told my mother about the warning shot that the regime had fired at me the year before, not long after the Mao book was published. One morning, when I came to my upstairs study, I was struck with a curious sensation that the place was empty. I looked at my bookshelves and the papers around, and they seemed to be where they had been the night before. Then I realized what was missing. The balcony that was incorporated into the room with a glass partition, with the other sides jutting out into mid-air, was bare of all my plants, including a big Japanese acer and a large jasmine whose massive shoots had twined around the trellises. They had all been cut with a serrated knife, an inch from the surface of the soil. What was more, the intruders had brought bags with them and taken away every bit, leaving the balcony empty and clean. The police found the area, the balcony, the garden and the fences undisturbed, and the doors and windows not tampered with. They concluded that the criminal damage was the work of highly skilled professionals who got into our balcony without leaving any marks. I thought of the film The Godfather, in which the mafia had sent a message to an uncooperative man by tucking the severed head of his favourite horse into his bed while he was asleep. It seemed to me that the killing and carting off of my beloved plants was also a message. We can get you. I did not know what they wanted of me, but decided I would carry on with my life as normal. The special branch gave us advice as well as protection. The advice I took with particular pleasure was to have a type of thorny climbing rose planted around the house, so any future intruders would inescapably leave traces of their identity. As a result, gorgeous roses have wrapped our house while their blade-sharp thorns help guard our home. In Chengdu, my mother and I were together the whole time. The scare of the visa rejection made me doubly treasure our time together. I spent a few days in Beijing, but saw only a handful of people who assured me that they were not afraid, or that they were on the surveillance list of the state security anyway. The bravery of these friends moved me deeply, especially when I returned the following year, 2008, and they immediately started helping me with the research for my next book, a biography of Empress Dowager Cixi. One evening, when the phone rang in my hotel room, a man gave a surname, then, "From the State Security Ministry, can we come up to your room to talk to you?" Flashing across my mind's eye were thugs barging in and putting a pillow over my face. I said, "Please don't come up. I am changing, and I will come down to meet you in the lobby when I am ready." The other side agreed. In the foyer, two pleasant-looking men, one in his early 30s and the other younger, greeted me. The 30-something gave me his surname again, and that of his colleague, offering no more specific information. He was immediately recognizable as the boss of the two. I later heard his team referring to him respectfully as "Womon Ling Dao," our leader, which rather surprised me, as I usually associated the term with someone older. The young leader now informed me of the purpose of their visit. I had just accepted an invitation to lunch the next day, and they would like me to back out of it. An old friend, Liu Jiaoju, had rung me with the invitation when I was in a taxi en route to the hotel from the archives. Obviously, either his phone was bugged or mine was. He said that some readers of the Mao biography were keen to meet me, and he would really like me to see them, as they were interesting people and some were influential bloggers. On the one hand, I'd promised not to talk about the Mao book in public in China. On the other, I was loath to say no to my friend. I said yes, reluctantly. The young leader asked me to ring Jiaoju and decline the invitation. I was actually relieved, as I knew I must not break my promise. But when the young leader asked me not to mention state security, I refused. They suggested that I say, "You understand, 你懂得," adding, "Everyone here knows what this means." I retorted, "Then what's the point of using this euphemism?" They did not insist, probably because I had already agreed on not going. And so the state security stepped out of the shadows into the open. In the future, when I arrived in Beijing, they would come to my hotel to have a chat, which boiled down to them making demands. One was that I promise not to see sensitive people, to which I answered that I did not know who these people were, and please could they show me the list. They never did. Another demand was that I not disclose my conversations with them, which, they claimed, was in accordance with Chinese law, that everyone who had met with the state security had to sign a piece of paper promising to keep their talks confidential. I expressed incredulity about the law and eventually said, "Please give me the piece of paper you said everyone had to sign, and I will show it to the British Embassy. They can advise me whether it is appropriate for a British citizen to sign such a document." The demand was dropped after that. Over the next 10 years, I met many minders. They were doing an obnoxious job, but they did it without additional personal nastiness. Once, 2 of them followed me to a bookshop. The specialist books were on the first floor, and they browsed on the ground floor among books of general interest. Afterwards, on our way to the car, one of them said animatedly, "In the era of spring and autumn, 770 to 476 BC, China produced so many thinkers. I am now sure, with the country doing so well, it will produce great thinkers again." I could not help snapping. "Thinkers? You must be joking. I wrote a book, and I am now cut off from all my friends and followed by you lot. How can anyone dare to think up original ideas in this environment? How can a country like this produce thinkers?" They fell silent. In March 2018, the National People's Congress made Chairman Xi the supreme leader for life by changing China's constitution. When I was with my mother in May of that year, Chairman Xi issued an order decreeing that any insult or slander of the honor and reputation of heroes and martyrs was a crime punishable by imprisonment. As Mao was regarded as the #1 hero of the nation, it began to sink in that as a biographer of Mao who documented his misrule, I faced incarceration when I was in China. Instead of fearing not being let into China to see my mother, I began to fear being let in, but not let out. I did not apply for a visa in 2019. Then came the COVID pandemic, and for 3 years my dilemma was suspended. My mother spent those years mostly in a hospital. She was well looked after, and whenever the lockdown rules were relaxed, my brother and sister would come outside her window and deliver her favourite foods. They even brought her home and celebrated her 90th birthday. We used WeChat to communicate. A minder had urged me to install it. His recommendation left no doubt that WeChat was under control of the regime, but there was little choice, as Western apps were mostly banned. Mother did not have a mobile, so I rang her carer or my siblings when they were with her. At the end of 2022, when Beijing abandoned its lockdown, my mother was infected with COVID. While her life was hanging by a thread, I was unable to see her even on the screen. My siblings could not visit her because of hospital rules, and her new carer, who had recently come out of a village, was terrified of receiving calls from abroad. It was only when my siblings were permitted to resume their visits that I saw her again on the phone. In the end, my mother pulled through. From late 2023, I noticed a change in Mother, who was now 92. She blew me kisses again and again. She also told me that she missed me terribly, which was most unusual. I said, "Mother, I will try to come and see you." She said tentatively, "But you can't get in. There are problems." Her carer thought she was referring to the lockdown and interjected, "People can come into China now. So-and-so's children have come from abroad." I could not explain to the carer what my problems were, for fear that she might be frightened and leave Mother, or even mistreat her. In March 2024, my mother had a hemorrhage again. When I rang her, she was lying in bed looking very weak. Slowly, she said, "I am over 90. Life will naturally move on to death. It's not a big deal. Do your own things well, and I am happy." And, as if she felt she might not have been explicit enough, "Don't come back for this." There was no doubt that by this, Mother meant her death. She now specifically asked me not to come to make sure I would not take any risks. With these words, my mother took the agony out of the most unbearable decision of my life. I pressed my lips on the screen and kissed her beautiful face.